Very well. Hello, bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you may be joining us. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University here in Ottawa, Canada, and I have the real privilege to be the project director for LERRN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and in other parts of the world, but especially focused on the needs and opportunities that are identified by our partners in East Africa and in the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we are working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions with and for refugees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I reside and on which Carleton University is located is the traditional and unceded land of the Algonquin people. I say this not just out of protocol, but out of respect, and in recognition of my status as a settler Canadian, but also in recognition of the fact that the questions of dislocation and dispossession that we discuss today are part of the history of this territory where I am right now. With that, let me say how delighted I am to welcome all of you. So we have some 150 individuals who've registered for this webinar. I see many continue to join us from around the world, from 4 different continents, for this second webinar in the LERRN-IDRC Webinar Series, focusing on refugee education during and beyond COVID-19. We have a fabulous group of speakers to help us engage with the question that explores the challenges and opportunities that COVID-19 presents for refugee education and how local perspectives on this issue can help inform policy responses at the global level. I'm also really delighted to share the role of moderating this conversation with my colleague, Barbara Shenstone from IDRC. Barbara joined IDRC in 2018 as the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, based in Amman, Jordan. Barbara brings more than 25 years of experience in the international development sector to her role, a lot of this work in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. Barbara is a very wise and experienced colleague who brings great experience, but also fresh perspectives and real innovative perspectives to the questions that we're discussing today. And I've always appreciated my conversations with Barbara, and I'm delighted that she's joining us in the role as co-moderator today. Some practicalities and etiquette before I turn proceedings over to Barbara to introduce the speakers and to get us started. Please note that this webinar is a view-only format. So please use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of the Zoom interface to pose questions, which I will then moderate in the second half of the webinar. Please be respectful in the posing of questions in the Q&A box. Inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or harmful language won't be tolerated and will lead to your removal from the webinar. So please be considerate of the moderators and the speakers and be respectful of the opinions of others as we engage in this dialogue. Third, I invite you to join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag Refugee Education and to also follow us on Twitter at Learning. I'll note that on Twitter late last night, we posted a link to 2 working papers that LERRN published just yesterday by 2 researchers with the Dadaab Response Association, based in Dadaab in northeastern Kenya. The papers focus on teacher training, creating a communities of practice, and the question of exam practices in secondary schools in the Kenyan context. And I encourage you to look at those papers. And also I invite questions from members of the Dadaab Response Association who are joining us for this webinar. If you have any technical questions along the way, please reach out to us on email, learn@carleton.ca. You can also follow us. We're on Zoom, but we're also live streaming on YouTube and on Facebook. So I encourage you to follow us with that. The webinar is being recorded, so that means that we'll be able to post a link along with a summary of this event on LERRN's website in due course, so please look for it there. And finally, you will receive a survey following this webinar to ask about your experience. I'd be really grateful if you could take a moment to complete that survey so that we can better understand how to make the webinar experience more meaningful and more accessible, both for our speakers, for whom I'm very grateful, and for the attendees who are joining us today from so many different points around the world. We hope you enjoy the webinar. I'm very much looking forward to it. I look forward to moderating the second part of the webinar proceedings. But now it's my real pleasure to turn proceedings over to my co-moderator, Barbara Shenstone. Barbara, over to you.
Good afternoon, and good evening, or good morning, wherever you may be in the world. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome today our 6 distinguished speakers, as well as our many guests and participants, to this webinar focusing on refugee education during and beyond COVID-19. My name is Barbara Shenstone. I'm the Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa for IDRC, the International Development Research Center. Our regional office is located in Amman, Jordan. IDRC, as part of Canada's international development efforts, is about to launch a 10-year strategy aligned with Sustainable Development Goals. Our new strategy will bring into focus the issue of forced displacement, building on the experience of our many projects, exploring the intersection of forced displacement with such issues as governance, human rights, digital innovation, and climate change, and of course, taking into account the impact of the global pandemic, COVID-19. It is a privilege today to be partnering with LERRN in this webinar, the second in a series under the leadership of Jennifer Kanji and Professor James Milner. We share with LERRN the objective of ensuring that the voices of those closest to the issues of forced displacement are heard and amplified locally and in the global arena. Access to education for refugees is an issue of critical importance, not only to refugees and their communities, but also to host communities and host governments. Education is a basic right for all, we know, but unfortunately remains inaccessible or inadequate for many refugee children as a result of limited resources, poor infrastructure, and legal constraints. I remember a conversation I had years ago when I worked for UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. We don't have oil or diamonds or cattle ranches, said the community leader. We have ourselves, our people, and what they bring for the future. What then could be more important than the education of our children, he said. This sentiment is common to many refugee experiences where people have lost everything and been dislocated. The challenges of providing and accessing quality education for everyone in the Middle East is urgent, and many interesting initiatives are underway to understand and address them. The global pandemic has brought new challenges, exposed cracks and weaknesses in various systems, and also triggered new approaches and innovations. Our distinguished panelists today will speak about how local responses and local innovation can be mobilized in times of COVID and beyond to enhance the education for refugees, thus improving opportunities for them to rebuild their lives and ensure their futures. Our webinar today is structured around sub-themes and geographical contexts, progressing from local to global perspectives. Our 6 panelists have 5 minutes to speak initially, with a little bit more for the first person speaking, and will address the webinar topic as it relates to their own work. I will be introducing each participant before they speak, and there's a fuller biography of each of them on the LERRN website. We aim to have a sufficient time for a question and answer session after the panelists have spoken. Et c'est avec plaisir que je vous invite à poser vos questions en français si vous le désirez. Our first speaker today is Mai Abu Moghli. She is senior researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies and research associate at Relief Center, University College London, which looks at issues of transformative learning and teacher development, teacher professional development. Mai's work focuses on critical approaches to human rights education, teacher professional development, and refugee education, among other subjects. To anchor our discussion, she will provide us first with an overview of the report that we are launching today by LERRN partners at the Center for Lebanese Studies. It is entitled Education Under COVID-19 Lockdown. It looks in particular at challenges and responses in Lebanon, Jordan, and the West Bank and Gaza. Over to you, Mai.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, everyone, and for LERRN to inviting me to be part of this great event and great panel. And I look forward to listening to all the experiences and great work being done around the world. As Barbara has mentioned, today I'll be talking about a report entitled Education Under COVID-19 Lockdown, Reflections from Teachers, Students, and Parents, looking particularly at Jordan, Lebanon, and the West Bank and Gaza. The report is based on a 3-month research we at the Center for Lebanese Studies have conducted with the support of LERRN. I know that there's a lot of work being done on COVID-19 and its impact on education. But the special thing about this report is that actually it was developed around the end of March, this March of 2020. So as the lockdown has just started and there was so much confusion of what needs to happen, what is actually going on, particularly in the field of education. Once our vision for the report and research was clear, based on initial conversations, mainly with teachers in the 3 countries, we conducted an online survey in April and May, and the results were finalized in June. We had just over 1,000 respondents to the survey from the 3 geographical locations. The majority were parents, and then the numbers of the respondents were teachers, and then the students were the least respondents. The aim of the report was not to find definitive answers or statistically solid and generalizable indicators. But at that very initial stage of the pandemic, with the confusion and rapid, mostly individual responses, we aimed to map out main trends of the impact of COVID-19 on the access and quality of education, as well as the impact on teachers, students, and parents. As we know, most of the work normally is focused on students. So we wanted to better understand the impact on teachers and parents as well as their role, and not only them as static individuals looking at what they're doing, but also how they are active agents. Based on the data, the report gives an overall understanding of where the main gaps and challenges are, particularly when distance education was introduced and during its initial stages of development and implementation, and particularly in the context of Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, where Lebanon and Palestine face complex crises. Finally, the data gave us a number of recommendations to be considered, particularly for policymakers, educators, and parents, to better respond to emergencies in the future, particularly to safeguard the access to quality education in the with a special focus on marginalized groups. Jordan and Lebanon have been framed by the international community as countries struggling to accommodate refugees and having a difficult socioeconomic situation. While in Palestine, the Israeli occupation has managed to destroy and strip Palestinians of their basic rights, including education. Thus, we need to consider these differences as the lockdown instigated by COVID-19 further accentuated the dire living conditions of large segments of the population due to these conditions. So considering these differences in the overall context and the compounded crises each country is facing, particularly in Palestine and Lebanon, the report aimed to give a comparative analysis between the 3 contexts, where we were able to identify similarities and differences. And from that, we were able to see patterns that might help in emergency response efforts. And we summarized that in a number of recommendations. As I have limited time, and I'm very thankful for your generosity in giving me 3 extra minutes, minutes. So please do stop me if I'm talking too much. And I know already I took a lot of my time. So I'm just gonna go through the main findings, and everyone has access to the report, so you can go through it, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. So this applies to a lot of context, I'm sure. So COVID-19 exposed and still exposing the weak infrastructure of the education systems in the 3 countries. There was a severe setback in access and quality of teaching and learning, particularly for marginalized children. Teachers had very little support from schools, particularly in public or government schools, who had limited support from the ministries of education. And that was more striking in Lebanon. The best situation was actually in Jordan. While Jordan didn't have an experience in school closures as Lebanon and Palestine do, Lebanon well before COVID, for example, in the uprising of October 2019 and the deteriorating economic conditions. And of course, in Palestine, particularly the West Bank and Gaza with the curfews and the attacks by the Israeli army. But Jordan actually had a better infrastructure, and they already had started a platform for online education prior to COVID-19. Teachers in private schools were exploited by longer working hours and sometimes losing parts of their salaries. Teachers mentioned that the best way for teaching and learning was to resort to low technology, particularly using WhatsApp, as the majority of children had no access to laptops or tablets, and very few number of had access to stable internet connection, particularly in Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, with regular electricity cuts. Governments had TV channels dedicated to distance education, but the respondents, all 3 groups, teacher, parents, and students, had a negative experience with those channels in terms of quality and level of learning. And of course, as they lack interaction, they're purely didactic. Students with special needs, especially with disabilities, and male students suffered the most in terms of exclusion and dropouts. Male students maybe were drawn to paid work, while students with disabilities were largely excluded or marginalized due to inaccessibility and unsuitability for the provision during that period of lockdown and online education. In terms of refugees, there was a difference between Palestinian and Syrian refugees, and also depending on the locations where these refugees are. So UNRWA, as Barbara mentioned, the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees, has an education and emergency program where that program is based on its preparation and experience in schools due to closures in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, and in the past 9 years in Syria. So students and teachers are more prepared, where the quality of education and access deteriorated, particularly where internet and electricity are not stable, for example, in Lebanon and Gaza. But Palestinian children still had relatively better access to education. Yet, in spite of the preparedness of UNRWA, the accessibility to these programs and the quality of teaching and learning are yet to be assessed, especially with a deteriorating economic situation in Lebanon, which is exacerbated with the refugee status. For Syrian children in non-formal schools in Lebanon, for example, there was complete loss of teaching and learning spaces and a lack of access to the internet, so online education was not even an option. Syrian children in Lebanese government second shift schools were not considered in any of the programs prepared by the Ministry of Education for the morning shift Lebanese students. In terms of parents, they found themselves struggling with the deteriorating economic conditions, juggling work and homeschooling, with no support from schools or other organizations, particularly for refugee parents. With limited access to internet and resources, some have multiple children to take care of, and that makes the situation even more difficult. And finally, and for me, that's the most important, the impact of not going to school has varied amongst children, as well as the ways through which they spent at home. In the 3 countries, the majority of the students who participated in the survey indicated that most negative impact was the social aspect of their school life. Most of the students noted that they missed their friends and their teachers. And based on these findings, we had some recommendations. I picked some of them. For policymakers, they need to start thinking about strengthening partnerships and collaborations between the public, private, and non-formal education by creating school networks and including private, public, UNRWA, and non-formal schools and teacher-parents associations in order to share experiences. So create these spaces and abilities for these different sectors to talk to each other. There's a need to make agreements with private internet suppliers to provide concessions for schools. Teachers said that there needs to be a development of alternative methods for assessment. They really struggled with that. Policymakers need to ensure that any platform or method used for teaching and learning to be accessible for children with disabilities. And finally, ensure a proper balance between the importance of academic education and the emotional and psychological well-being of children as well as teachers. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mai. It's a very interesting report. As you say, it's a taste. It demonstrates there's a lot more to be looked at, but interesting approaches, varied approaches across the Middle East, trying to deal with the challenges of distance learning or different approaches during COVID. Our second speaker, so thank you, Mai, we'll be coming back to many of the issues you've raised. Our second speaker today is Dr. Elaine Chase, who is Associate Professor in Education, Health Promotion, and International Development at University College London Institute of Education. Her work explores the sociological dimensions of health, well-being, and development, particularly for those likely to experience marginalization and exclusion. Today, she will focus on a 5-year program that brings into relief the experience and challenges of teachers in Lebanon. Over to you, Elaine.
Many thanks, Barbara. And again, thank you for the invitation today. It's a great pleasure to be here and share experiences with people from across the globe, which is fantastic. Just picking up on Mai and Maha's report, there are obviously some really clear recommendations there, which relate to the importance of the local and understanding the local. So really understanding the needs of communities. For creating professional development opportunities for distance and online learning, the importance, as Mai mentioned, of strengthening and building partnerships between the public, the private and non-formal sectors, the need to be aware of differences in access and resources with respect to bandwidth and technologies for learners in these settings, and the need, of course, to promote and support the inclusion and the experiences of learners and their perspectives. So the work that Mai and Maha and many other colleagues in London and Lebanon have been doing for the past 5 years is to think about what inclusive growth and prosperity might mean in a context of mass displacement in Lebanon. And Mai, Maha, and myself and other colleagues work on the education strand of this work through the Relief Centre based at University College London. It's a sustained collaboration with the Lebanese University, with UNWA, with the Centre for Education, Research and Development, the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, the American University of Beirut, and many other non-governmental and civil society partners working in the field. So it's been, over the last 3 years or so, we've built a really strong set of partnerships linking back to the points that Mai was making. And our key concern was how best to respond to the professional development needs of educators in the context of mass displacement in Lebanon, where there is the highest proportion of refugees per capita in the world. So we've been working with those partners to develop some online digital resources, working around the idea of MOOC, or massive open online courses, which we've reframed to understand as massive open online collaborations. And the first of these was called Transforming Education in Challenging Environments. It's run twice now over the last couple of years, and the third run of it will take place in February next year. Its core features were to shift from this idea of a course or didactic sort of learning to a platform of collaboration where people could really share their learning and experiences of teaching in these really complex circumstances. It involved an intensive process of co-design. It involved very much going to the field, talking to teachers about their experiences, videoing and filming them in their places and the context within which they were working, talking about their experiences, their challenges, as well as the opportunities they were creating, the creativity that they were mustering in these situations. and then creating a space where that could be shared and used for reflection with others. Adopting a very critical approach to what we might understand as transformative education and learning in these contexts. So we built theory into the online collaboration and created spaces for learners and teachers to discuss this. It was available in 2 languages, in Arabic and in English, on 2 separate platforms. So FutureLearn for English and EdRAC for Arabic. And what that did was it built the basis for a very strong partnership working, so that when COVID arrived in March of this year, it meant that it was possible to respond very quickly to the needs of people within the MENA region and of teachers in the MENA region. So very quickly, that same collaboration base enabled the development of a new MOOC called Online Teaching Be Ready Now, which was responding to the needs of teachers really needing to learn very quickly about how to engage with learners online. It followed the same process of co-design and collaboration, but it was developed over a short period of just 4 weeks and was launched on the 26th of April in 2020. The online collaboration is open. It runs for, the engagement is for a period of 2 weeks, and it's open, and so it's constantly open the whole time. It involves video tutorials, mentoring, spaces for discussion, and a whole range of collaborative learning activities that happen. To date, it's reached 35,000 people across the MENA region. It's in Arabic, and it continues to be open to other learners as well. And I think what the take-home point for us has been that the time and intensity of working very closely together with colleagues and partners very closely on the ground has been really provided a huge opportunity for us to respond in these really difficult times. So the core for us is around collaboration, around really positive partnership working and co-design processes. So that's all I'll say for now, but happy to pick up questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Your emphasis on collaboration and partnership. It is amazing how this COVID, in spite of all the difficulties, has really spurred on the innovation and the intensity of work to help people learn. So our next speaker is Marwan Tarazi, Director of the Center for Continuing Education at Birzeit University. Marwan's work focuses on the design and on the design of development models very specific to local contexts for transforming the way people learn, for the way they work, and for the way they interact within society in a rapidly changing world. His work currently is structured around distance learning, and his intervention today will speak to that dimension. Over to you, Marwan.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much for the introduction. When we started to work looking for, in education, it's something we've been struggling with for a long time. Because today there's one and only one structured educational system, at least in MENA, and this system is not working, it's failing. And what we've noticed people doing over and over again is everybody trying to work around the system, everybody trying to fix the inputs of the system, trying to do different teacher education. And the problem is that at least, and I'm sure a lot of people around this table or this webinar are convinced that this system is just not going to provide the quality of education and the educational outcomes that are required today. And it's not providing the quality outcomes that are required of the mainstream educational system, let alone refugees, people who are displaced, who are out of. And so this has been something we've been struggling for several years now. And we've done, the question is how can we give learners the freedom to learn in a different context outside? Because, how can we create an alternative learning model system where students learn alternatively there, and they have the freedom to learn differently. And this is where we set out to work on this. And we said, you know, there's technology, there's internet, everybody's getting connected. And so what we also said is that, okay, we're going to work on this model. We're going to put the typical technological problems aside because we know that everybody's not connected. There are marginalized people who do not have connectivity, etc. We're not going to design a solution that fits everybody because we know projecting down the road, everybody's going to get connected. And there are solutions where you can do online, offline, you know, people do not have to be fully connected all the time. So what the model we did is that we said, okay, for the past 10 years, we've been working on something called the experiential learning objects. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a model where we empower teachers how to teach and support students learn completely differently within the educational system. The main point here when we started to think is that, okay, the ministries of education have what you call a curriculum, and they have set objectives that the curriculum is supposed to achieve. So we said, okay, why don't we achieve the same objectives of the curriculum in a different way and give students an alternative way of learning with this curriculum? So what we did is now recently with what we did with what we call it ILOBs, Internet, Interactive, Independent Learning Objects. And what we did is we're doing it with support from the IDRC, this project now, is that we're designing learning objects that students can, technically speaking, learn on their own. And we're aware that of the various issues. You know, there are issues, for example, that we don't want it to make it too prescriptive because we want students to think and be creative and to do things. So this was one of the challenges we had. We also know that students do not necessarily learn well on their own at that age. You want to give them guided training. So we're designing along these things, ways for students that they can learn with mentors supporting the learning. And when we say mentors here, the difference is we do not necessarily require very highly qualified teachers. So again, going in a refugee setting, refugees would get these ILOBs, and you have maybe engineers, maybe you have educated people within the refugee community. They can become the mentors, they can support the students learn. And then the last modality for the learning would be where teachers would take them in their classroom and teach with them in a structured way. So the idea is that they can learn, achieve the objectives, but they get it in chunks. So for example, one chunk would be they would get they want to learn Newton's laws. So they get this Newton's laws. And an important point we're working on, we haven't finished out, is that when they finish Newton's laws, they get a certification right now from Brazil University that they've acquired the competencies and skills for these Newton's laws. So if they do Newton's laws and other competencies, at the end of the day, they have a certification that they finished the educational requirements or the curriculum requirements for grade 6 or for grade 7 or for so on and so forth. So for refugees who are out of school that take these competencies and want to go back to a normal setting, then they have this is my timer telling me I'm all over, the competencies that they're telling me that they can go back to school with those skills. And for students in regular settings, they can learn with them on their own outside, and they achieve the same competencies for the curriculum. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Marwan. Whenever you speak, I feel like I'd like to come and be a student again and learn these things again in this much more interesting, creative way. Thank you. Our fourth speaker is Mr. Abdullahi Dahir Mire, who is a freelance journalist and refugee activist based in Kenya. He is founder of the Dadaab Book Drive, an all-volunteer initiative to collect books for school-age children and youth living in refugee camps. Abdullahi also runs a radio show in Dadaab camp in northeast Kenya called Radio Gargar, through which he has been able to provide information and address misinformation about COVID-19 for the refugee community in Kenya. He will tell us about his work in a refugee camp setting in Kenya. Abdullahi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. This is great opportunity for those of us who are locally in the camps, those who really feel the everyday struggle of the youth and the children that are really in need longing for education. That having said, I am a testimony to what refugee education can do. I went to all my education system in refugee camp in the Dab, that's in northern Kenya, once being the largest refugee camp. So ideally, why I went adventured into this project, which I later changed into refugee-led organization. That is currently we are called the Refugee Youth Education Hub, is mainly to support. Ideally, I'm someone who strongly believes that the only thing that refugees can inquire when they go back to their home country or resettle to the third world country like Canada and US is education. Education is the only weapon that you can get out of the camp, that if you keep it, you'll be better. So I started this book drive thing after I graduated and was working like a freelance journalist, a freelance researcher with different international organizations and research organizations. I have inquired because the camps have been designed way back when I was still young, when I fled from Somalia in 1991. They were designed to hold about 90,000, and today they hold about 200,000. And at some point, the camp hold about 500,000 people. And the facilities are still the same, like schools, due to budget constraints and challenges, the schools are the same. So I thought as a young guy, what can you do? I said, this need everywhere, right, left, center, from a book to a teacher allocation to a classroom spacing to other resources, name it, any education resources, to a tertiary, because tertiary is only that there are only 3% of people who went to high school in the DAB go to universities. So you can understand that with the trying of UNHCR, their best to support these students. So I went to one of the schools and then approached by one student who said, look, he asked me a favor if I can buy her a biology book, because at the end of it all, she wants to go to a medical school and she cannot go it without a biology book. I tell her, are there not biology books? Yes, there's a biology book, but she shares with 60 other students in her class. That was pain to me. I have said I will buy you one from my pocket. That's about $10. But to get it from Nairobi, talk to a friend send it. But I say, no, this is not enough. I came, bull out networks, raise books with supports of different donors, raise about 50,000 learning books for high school students. Much later, collect networks through the support of other friends, both national and international, then raise up books for a library. We are to have our first working public library for both students in and out this year, May, but due to COVID, that has been postponed. The books are in the safe, but I'm glad UNHCR have supported to give us space to run the first working library. The challenges are also, we had this fair share of challenges before the COVID. Now the COVID came and students have missed classes totally, both high school, primary, and universities. What we're trying to do is there's only 2 or 1% connections in the high school in the DAB today, with support from Vodafone and a UNHCR project that is a campaign that is spearheaded by UNHCR. So what I'm trying to do is build networks, make school inter-school international teamwork. Like I'm trying to now figure out schools in Canada or in US to have connection with the schools in the DAP, so that these students can get the much needed education that they really need it. On that note, currently education is in limbo because the connection is too low. The internet connection in Kenya is provided by Safaricom. For those of you who have traveled to Kenya can witness me, and Safaricom is one of the expensive data bundles to use. So currently things are challenging, but I'm always inspired by students coming from different countries, from Somalia, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, who are really eager to learn. Despite all these challenges I'm telling you, there are students that are reading, trying to make extra lessons, trying to read their own when they share books in high number. Maybe 7, 8 students share a mathematics book, and still they're making ends meet. And the only thing that makes me proud is that these students shine out in the Kenyan national exams. The WISC, the World Universities Scholarship, is an amazing scholarship that takes 1% of students who succeed from secondary. Evilly can bear witness. They take sharp students that get straight A or B's. And this comes from the students that have all these challenges. So my thing is to build out a network. That's why I formed the organization called the Refugee Youth Education Hub, to build people who are like-minded to support these youth, both those are in school and those out of school. Why I say those out of school is that there's a policy in Kenya that sometimes the dab is placed in the border between Kenya and Somalia, and many people might feel like if these people are idle, they can join the criminal groups that are fighting in Somalia, like the Al-Shabaab. So maybe to me, what I feel like is, if I get libraries for these guys, if I get tertiary education, which is an opportunity, we can change minds. Education changes minds. It makes people positive. So that's where I stand. And understanding the dynamics and went through these same schools gives me power. Sometimes I end up in classes acting as a motivational speaker, which most of the time they like. So this is a great opportunity, and I always use my networks to mobilize resources and get support at the grassroots level in the camps.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi. It's a different perspective and a very welcome one from Kenya and that camp setting where the pressures are different. The long history of it is different. Thank you very much. Now for our last two speakers, Evelyn Jepkemi and Jennifer Roberts. They will help us connect these thematic conversations from the local perspectives we've heard to more global issues and other contexts. Evelyn Jepkemi is the Regional Education Advisor for WUSC, the World University Service of Canada, based in Nairobi, Kenya. She holds a PhD in education combined with further postgraduate studies in curriculum and education policy. She currently provides technical support to the Kenya Education Equity Program and a project called LEAP, called Learning Through Education and Access to Employment Pathways. Evelyn nurtures a keen interest in designing and implementing education programs for marginalized populations. The floor is yours, Evelyn.
Thank you very much, Barbara. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to share the experiences that we have had in refugee education as World University Service of Canada in Dadaab, and as well as in Kakuma in Kenya, and in Kalobeye, which is a new settlement settlement for refugees. So the schools or basic education in refugees centers or refugee camps in Kenya are within the framework of the Ministry of Education in terms of curriculum. So the curriculum is basically the Kenya national curriculum. However, the management of the delivery of that curriculum and the schools are under UNHCR and other agencies. And so unlike the public schools, refugee schools do not receive the kind of technical support and other incentives from government. And so within that context, therefore, the World University Service of Canada has come in to design interventions to support quality of education through teacher training, through helping learners that are struggling. As you might understand how the refugee setup is, you have overage learners and sometimes learners that drop out of school and come back to school and those kinds of things. So we have designed pedagogy training for teachers to be able to support teachers who may not necessarily be trained as teachers. Sometimes we have volunteers, and so we do train these teachers. So that is basically what we have done previously. Now, coming COVID, and the schools are closed, and the efforts that were made immediately after schools were closed was to be able to reach learners with the national curriculum through distance learning, through radio, through TV, and through internet. And I think my colleague Abdullahi has already said the internet is a struggle in those parts of the country. And so, and the same thing for radio and TV. And even if the signal for radio and TV were available, there are very few families that can be able to actually afford and have a TV within their families. So we realize, therefore, that there is a big challenge in the sense that while the government is trying to reach learners while school is closed during the lockdown, refugee populations of students were actually almost completely left out. And then the initial target was to take the curriculum directly to the home where the child is, and therefore enhance the role of parents and caregivers to support learning. Now, most of our refugee parents are not able to speak the language of curriculum delivery in Kenya, which is English. And so we also realized that even that for our refugee students was going to be a big challenge. And then, of course, the evolving role of the teacher as online teachers, even where we had partners who were able to do online learning, there was need to support teachers to be able to deliver lessons online. It's different when you are standing in front of a class and delivering curriculum, and when you are doing it over Zoom. And so there was a challenge. And then, of course, the question of multi-level online classes, whereby lessons were packaged and put out by different partners and different actors in ICT. So that is the context. And for us, we focus especially on girls who are already, before COVID, were already marginalized within these communities. And therefore, at the time when lockdown happened, here are some of the challenges that we faced. So the first thing that I mentioned was that at best of times, refugee students face remarkable challenges. And already as we speak, 73,000 of school-going age refugees in Kenya are unable to access school. And then the second challenge had to do with the fact that those kids, as well as the ones who were already in school, having gone home under lockdown, were not able to access education in any way. And what that does is that it expands the achievement gap between the children who are able to access online learning, as well as these children who are in the refugee camps. Because at the end of the day, they will all sit the same examination. But some of, especially the urban children, continued with school. They continued learning online. But those in the rural areas, and particularly the marginalized areas, including the refugee centers, were not able to access this education. So long school closure led also to learning loss. We realized that some of our students had forgot some of the skills that they had already learned, particularly for those whom we had helped to gain literacy. That amount of literacy began to go down. And of course, there was limited capability for interaction, because the lockdown meant that movement was restricted. So we had to quickly think about how we can be able to engage with the teachers and support the teacher competency, because before COVID, we had already plans to do face-to-face training of teachers, but we very quickly had to think about what to do. And as we were deliberating on these issues, we realized that there were organic social groups among the teachers through WhatsApp. And so we decided to use this WhatsApp to create you know, very small modules of training to be able to send them to the teachers and have one WhatsApp meeting with them once a week to be able to engage with them. And it proved very useful to us, because we realized the kind of questions and the kind of fears that teachers had with regards to this situation of COVID. And so it became a support system even for the teachers as they kind of discussed and worried about how best to go about preparing for the opening of schools. The other challenge, of course, that we had to do with the economic downturn for families and gendered effects of COVID, where a lot of learners were forced into chores, some into forced labor and worst transactional sex situations, and high rates of forced marriages. And all these things came to the fore during COVID. And so we decided to come up with some few innovations that we thought might be useful. And among the first ones were to support these organic groups that were coming out, because even students themselves started creating peer groups to discuss content, curriculum content. We did the same for the teachers. We also had cash transfers grants that were sent to families. And these cash transfers, although they were not necessarily attached to education, we felt that it cushioned, especially the girls, to enable them to be able to focus on their studies and later on be able to come back to school. And of course, we've continued to advocate for refugee inclusion in the national system of education, because then the refugee kids will be able to get the incentives that other students are able to receive. So I think in all of this, what we found most important was that there are always organic solutions that come out of the communities, and it's important to focus on that and be able to support that moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting, very rich. Our next speaker, our last panelist, is Jennifer Roberts, who speaks to us today from Copenhagen. She is a senior education officer for emergencies at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. During 2020, she has supported the coordination of UNHCR's education section's COVID-19 response. And between 2014 and 2019, she had a very relevant practitioner experience holding the position of senior education officer with UNHCR in Turkey, which, as you know, holds huge numbers of refugees from Syria, where she was responsible for establishing UNHCR's education program and working closely with national authorities to implement a variety of programs for children, youth, and adults. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and good morning, good afternoon, even good evening to those who are joining us. Very warm greetings from here in Copenhagen. So much has been said by many of the other speakers. I just want to highlight a few key points in terms of the context of refugee education, and then move over to talk a little bit about what we think the implications are going to be of this pandemic and of these lockdowns for refugee education. And many of the trends and the patterns that Evelyn spoke about, what they have seen in Kenya, what has been seen in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, is actually mirrored around the world. Just to underline and to underscore that as of this year, only 52% of refugee children are enrolled in schools. So even before the pandemic, there was a huge number of children and young people not in education. And of those who were enrolled, 90% were affected by school closures due to COVID. And even now, many of those schools still remain closed and only have reopened for a few grades. And we know that this has had a very profound effect on children. Many of the difficulties that Evelyn spoke about, of those who tried to continue to learn were not just seen in Kenya, but those same experiences were replicated around the world, with the digital divide having a very significant impact on the extent to which refugees were actually able to benefit and enjoy and learn through many of the emergency distance models that were put into place. As has been said, many areas are not reached by radio and television signals. Many people don't have the handsets, don't have connectivity. Not everybody has smart internet phones or even phones that could work through using SMS technology to receive education materials. What we've learned is that often mixed modalities are the most successful, often those that blend low-tech printed materials as well as technology-enhanced materials. Because so many children don't, as Abdullahi mentioned, don't even have books. Don't have books at the school, but don't have books at home, don't have the opportunity to read at home. And so those reading and those literacy skills that people have worked hard to acquire, you start to erode when children are not in school. And that not only were there disruptions to learning, as other speakers have mentioned, but also there were disruptions to school feeding programs that provide a really important nutritional support to learners. And as schools start to go back around the world, what do we think the impact is going to be? Unfortunately, the situation is dire. We had an emergency in refugee education around the world, and although there had been gains over the last 5-10 years, there are very serious fears that those gains are going to be eroded, that we're going to see increased dropouts of students. In some modeling that was done with the Malala Fund saw that based on the previous experiences in other pandemics, it is possible that up to 50% of girls who were in secondary school will drop out. And in certain countries where enrollment was already low, this could drop to 0% re-enrollment, meaning that a whole generation of young girls don't complete school. And already refugee children are far less likely to complete secondary school. At the moment, only around 27% of girls, 27% of children are in secondary school compared to a much higher percentage in primary. And now with the pandemic, with those girls dropping out, that is going to have profound impacts on communities. Poor infrastructure in many refugee schools, in camps, but also in refugee hosting areas, may make schools unsafe places to be. There are some schools in camps where more than 400 children are using one hand washing point. So some of the basic guidelines on how to minimize the transmission of COVID are not going to be able to be implemented. There are fears that learning poverty will increase, that the quality of education has been affected. And we also know that those who don't acquire foundational skills effectively, this has a knock-on effect as children move through their educational careers and deal with more complex content. Dropouts, poor learning outcomes, fewer children going on to secondary and tertiary education are going to have an impact on future earning potential. And this is going to have a devastating impact on refugee communities in the future, and that we will see lower transition rates. And I mean, all of that is a very negative perspective, but this pandemic also offers us opportunities to think differently and to build back better, to look at how do we respond, not only in terms of empathy. I think this pandemic has actually created a moment where people can actually understand how quickly an education emergency can affect everybody. That this is not just something that can happen to other people and people out there. And so that I would hope that the empathy that has been created through this experience will actually make people more responsive to refugee issues. Also, the importance of local responses. In the chat, you'll have seen links to some publications speaking about how refugees themselves have been played an incredibly active role in the response and ensuring that learning continues. We've heard about the need for more flexible learning modalities, for more catch-up programs, for greater flexibility in learning, recognition of learning through different modalities, and the need for a greater variety of opportunities to learn. We've also seen that this crisis has highlighted the need for preparedness at a national system, but also at local systems of being able to adapt. It's also highlighted the need to accelerate training of teachers on digital education, not just refugee teachers, but all teachers. And that this really is a pivotal point for education as a whole. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to pause there and hope to be able to answer questions later. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer, the way you've highlighted many of the issues that people have raised. We'll now go into the next section of our program today. So I will hand over to Professor Milner, who will facilitate the discussion and question and answer session. Over to you.
Thank you very much,
James.
Barbara. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, and thank you. We already have 3 questions in the Q&A box. I invite all attendees to make use of the Q&A box. There's just such powerful questions that come out from the presentations that we've had. Let me pose 2 or 3 questions that build from the 3 questions we already have in the Q&A box and that come out of the presentations that we've heard, and then I'll invite speakers to offer quick responses to that before we turn to a second round of questions. And I might do these in reverse order. So here are the 3 questions that I have. Jennifer, the first one builds from the point that you made about the role of refugees themselves. We've learned a lot about the importance of refugee-led responses. Publication that I was able to put out with a number of refugee leaders looked at the role of refugee-led responses to the pandemic itself and showed how refugees are the first to respond, especially when international actors are so limited in mobility and concerns of access. So what would be useful to hear from speakers, especially in the Middle East and in East Africa, is to reflect on the role of refugee leadership in providing that safety net, that rapid response, and what that says about the role of refugee inclusion, which is central to the Global Compact on Refugees, what this provides as an opportunity to really document the importance of that leadership so that when we rebuild refugee responses in the aftermath of COVID, we have a better understanding of the role of refugees and host communities in the actual doing of that work. So the first question is to reflect on the importance of refugee leadership. Of course, a shameless plug that the next webinar is on refugee responses. It will be coming in mid-December, so watch this space. The second question that I have relates to the impact of global processes in local context. I've just put up in the chat box the list of co-sponsors for the theme of education at the Global Refugee Forum. In what turned out to be the very, very early days of the transmission of COVID-19, 3,000 representatives of states and civil society gathered in Geneva for the Global Refugee Forum. And of all of the sub-themes, the theme on refugee education was perhaps the most impressive. When you look at the list of states and other organizations who really mobilized around this opportunity, first identified really at the Leaders Summit in 2016 and commitments to refugee education, taking that forward in this huge momentum that we saw. So my second question is, Jennifer, to you from the global perspective, what we see in terms of the ability to sustain that momentum in the context of crisis, or to pivot that momentum from longer term investments in education to some more of this rapid response. But then to Abdullahi and Evelyn and Elaine and Marwan and Mai, to reflect on to what extent this significant level of activity that we see at the global level, to what extent did that translate to a sense of momentum in local contexts? What does this tell us about the link between the global and then the local? And then my third question speaks to 2 of the points in the Q&A box, first from Mustafa Alio and second from Baray Abdi, relates to the question of context. Evelyn, Mai, Abdullahi, Jennifer, you all talked about questions that we ask about education need to be asked in relation to the context where education is being delivered. So we have from Barry's point in the chat box about security concerns in the camp, Mustafa's point about income support, what we've heard about internet access, that wherever education happens, whether it's in camp or settlement context, or whether it's in urban settings, there's very different questions of context in terms of infrastructure, services, the environment, the economic context. Abdullahi, I was in Dadaab on the day in 2004 when Safaricom extended cell phone coverage to the camps. And I remember the euphoria of all of a sudden being connected. But all of a sudden, that moment of connection then leads to all of these questions of maintaining that infrastructure and expanding that infrastructure. So my third question relates to how do we take these questions about education and frame them in a way that has global meaning, but responds to the context within which education happens, the extent to which we need to be bringing other partners into this conversation on education, and that if we're not engaging with development partners, if we're not engaging with peace and security actors, with with the political actors that create a space that's conducive for education, how far can we get with education conversations alone? I'd invite you to reflect on those three questions. I'll give you just 2 minutes. If you can offer some quick responses to those, I see that there are some more questions coming up in the Q&A box. And I'm going to use the universal language of Zoom, of sort of who's making eye contact with the screen. And Maya, I'm going to put you on the spot, that if I could ask you first to respond, and perhaps we'll go in the order of Mai first, and then Elaine, Marwan, Abdullahi, Evelyn, and then Jennifer. Pick which elements of those three questions you'd like to speak to for 2 minutes each. Mai, over to you, please.
Okay, you started with me and then Elaine, and we assume our position as critical academics who do not want to be institutionalized within the INGO world. So here, you need to see our critical approach. So basically, in terms of the role of refugee leadership, I mean, in our experience in Lebanon, Syrian refugees has created their own spaces for teaching and learning, which they call now non-formal education, but they are actually schools with classrooms and teacher professional development, and they use the Lebanese curriculum. Kids have exams, but there's no certification. So these kids, in most of the time, are unable to enroll in formal schooling. So there is refugee leadership. There's a creation of their own institutions, but then that does not lead into integration into the system. So that takes us also to the idea of the importance of certification. Is it actually important? Why is it important? And also the question is like, why is education important for refugees if they can't get employability, if they're not integrated into the society? Because of the politicians' unwillingness, they don't have the political will to actually do that. So there's a political question that's beyond the technicalities of education, the provision of education, whether it be it for the local community or the international organizations. Doesn't matter how much we push, regardless where we're coming from, top down, bottom up, if there's no political will, there will not be any impact or very little impact at the end, even if there's big refugee leadership. In terms of significance of the momentum, that also links to the political will. My colleague Maha Shaib wrote in Democracy Now! A great article last month on the political will and the, what do you call it? The relationship between the donor and the government, as particularly in Lebanon, with a massive corruption of the government, and how refugees go basically they got lost through the cracks. And at the end, it's the relationship between the donor and the UN agencies and the INGOs and the government, regardless of what the benefit is for refugees. So that's another question that we need to think about beyond the technicalities of the provision of education. So to think about the momentum of the impact eventually on the long run. And in terms of education in other fields, of course, we need to always think of interdisciplinarities and multi-partnerships to be able to actually provide a meaningful provision of education beyond neoliberal job creation, employability. for well-being and better future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mai. It's a question I'm going to come to in the second round. Is two questions that have just been posted in the Q&A box about adult education and vocational training, and some of the questions around, using education to address labor market gaps. So we might come to that with time in the second round. Elaine, can I pass the floor to you, please?
Thanks so much, James. So yes, I mean, building on the points that that Mai was making in terms of the role of refugees themselves, I think that raises really important questions at the modes of education, the kind of forms of education that emerge, which speak to questions of what is education for, and why, and what is it about, and what is the value for children and young people and adult learners. And one of the projects that I can think of that springs to mind is one of our partners, the multi-agency projects in Lebanon, works around really about rethinking about education as a process for identity forming. And they've been world leading in the whole process of robotics with refugee children and young people. So they've invested into the sciences, and these young learners are now world leading in a whole program of robotics. They've completely transformed their image on the global scene as not being needy children in receipt of donations, but as world leading in terms of their creativity. And that's been really transformative. And there are many other examples like that as well. I think it raises big questions about the connection and disconnect between the meanings and values of education and how they sit within existing educational programs, and this idea that there'll be this convergence, which doesn't always happen. And often through leadership, refugee leadership, we learn that people want very different things from education systems. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing I'd really just hone in on a bit is the idea of context. So taking these global ideas about what we want to achieve through education and how we deal with the very particularities of the different contexts with relation to security, income, internet access, and whatever. And I think it is about this constant processes of absolutely understanding the context within which we're learning, really giving voice to the range of people that are stakeholders in those situations, and really understanding those contexts before we try and respond in any way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very helpful point. And I think, it links very well to Mai's point about sort of understanding the role of education in the context, as you say, of identity formation, but also, the Maha's article that you referenced, Mai, I'll put a link to that up in the chat box, in terms of, education not being an extension of policy imperatives around containment, but that it really does play this central role in terms of empowerment and emancipation, which I think is a critically important point. But Marwan, on this question of context, but also the meaning of global policy discussions in local contexts. Of course, the context of Ramallah and Palestinian engagement with education in relation to global policy discussions of the refugee regime are somewhat different. But I'd like to turn to you now for your perspective on these questions of refugee-led responses, the meaning of global policy discussions in local context, but also how we respond, how our conversations about education respond to the specificity of context. Marwan, over to you, please.
I'm going to go back to my initial point. I think that we have a system that's not working. The existing educational paradigm is not working. And I'm going to keep repeating, there's no point in keep on beating on the dead horse. We have to think differently, because if we think differently, and like, Elaine and others have mentioned, for example, if you empower people, if they learn, if they know how to do things differently, then you liberate them, then you no longer have to sit and wait for this government job or for this government to give you the job. We have, we're moving in an entirely different world. There's a future of work, and there's future societies, and there's so many things that are changing around us that the current education system is not responding to. So if we say, let's try to figure out how to make this, how to make, do things so that people can learn in the traditional system, that's not going to get anywhere. We're going to stay boxed into this system. So again, that's why, like I keep saying, I'm sort of obsessed with this idea of how can we think of doing something different for getting students outside this framework, because that would liberate everybody. That would liberate, the children and their families and the future. And this is, that's where the role of thinking, the global framework thinking of what to do with refugees, political leadership, refugee leaders, everybody has to get on board with this thinking and to work on it.
And I think that raises a really important challenge in terms of responding to educational needs within the context of the crisis. So responding to the micro while thinking about that macro, and going back to the point that we heard earlier about thinking from first principles of what education is for, what's the purpose, what's the intention of education. One of the papers that we published from the Dadaab Response Association focused on the issue of exam practices in Kenya. And so, in a similar way, the way that exams originally had this intention of identifying and certifying and qualifying, but how the practices of exam taking produce these unintended consequences and perverse externalities that have very significant impacts on people's lives. So how to think about that structural change and responding to those large-scale drivers while still responding to the immediate needs is a challenge, is a balance that I think we all face. I see Barbara with a smile on her face. This is a challenge that IDRC faces on a daily basis. But in that context, I think the conversation between the MENA context and the East Africa context is really important, because we see how, while there is variation across context, that there's very important similarities in terms of the appetite for education and also the resilience of learners and teachers as well. Abdullahi, if you're still with us, I'd invite you. Your presentation really focused on the importance of leadership and some of these challenges of context. I'm wondering if you could offer sort of a reflection from Dadaab in terms of what impact these global policy discussions have had in local contexts, and if there's something we can learn from that. And as I invite Abdullahi to offer his response, I'm going to post the link to the piece that was written by Maha Shoaib on sort of the role of education and investments in education within this argument of sort of neoliberal approaches in terms of containment of refugees within regions, which is something that applies with equal force in MENA as it does in East Africa. And I encourage you to consider that piece at your leisure. Abdullahi, let me turn the floor to you.
If you back me, but please, once again, if you back.
Yeah, so the question that I was really asking is, in your presentation, that you shared with us the reflection of the importance of context, the importance of leadership from within refugee communities themselves. A point that I made as I was thinking about the points that you raised in your presentation was in December 2019 with the Global Refugee Forum, with such a huge emphasis on education in global policy discussions, to what extent you have seen changes within the Dadaab context as a result of the momentum that has really been built up at a global level for these discussions on education. Are there opportunities that you see because of global attention to the question of education that can be harnessed and mobilized in a context like Dadaab?
It is yes or no question. Because it is yes, because they should. I'm optimistic about it, but no, because the dynamics now, the refugees are big. I always talk about the donor fatigue, and that's why sometimes I look for local problems, local solutions, because if a pledge is made in December about $1 million that will be shared globally, that means, the refugee crisis as we speak, Ethiopians are fleeing Ethiopia to Sudan and Syria, name it, the crisis we have. So it will be a drop in the ocean. But the thing, I'm a bit optimistic. This year, there was more focus, and I'm a bit optimistic about this. The refugee-led organizations have been supported. If this happens at a grassroots level, and we, even the refugee-led organizations, should open our minds, look at the private sectors, look at the other organizations, embassies that reach out, networks. So with that, if refugee-led organizations will be supported, then that will be a great one. You said it will be December, yeah? December 14th? Yeah, December 14th in Canada.
We're hammering down the date in December, but it will be either the 10th or the 15th. So follow us on Twitter to find out.
Yeah, so this will be a great thing. And then the more you indulge with the local voices, the more you grassroots are supported, it will be better. But the focus now, why I'm so much in dilemma, is the gap between, in the Dab and Kakuma, the gap between the high school and tertiary education. You understand, only 3% or 2% sometimes transit to higher education, including those even going out, getting world universities that is beyond the Dab. So I appeal to universities, organizations, private sectors to come up and support. Like every university have our refugee support centers, many in Germany, in UK, in Canada. So if these universities also have maybe a lot of refugee students coming in from Kenya, from South Sudan, or from Syria, that will have been something amazing. And to me, the more this conversation is open, the more things will be done. That's why I'm so much grateful to James and his team for giving us this opportunity right at the field, which is really a great opportunity to us. But I'm optimistic. If things continue, then the more we indulge local refugee-led organizations that can support the communities, both the host and the refugee, the better chances of getting better education for refugee students.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. I appreciate that. We have time now for interventions from Evelyn and from Jennifer before I turn things back to Barbara to help us conclude. Evelyn, can I pass the floor to you, please?
Thank you very much. So I just want to talk about the local education in the global context and the discussions that we have at the global level and how they can trickle down to empowering refugees. And of course, the example that we have from Kenya is that the refugees that we have live in the camps, and they don't come out of the refugee camps. And so the question would be then, the dream of families of taking their children to school so they can be empowered economically and socially is kind of nipped in the bud for most refugee families, because as Abdullahi said, we only have 3% who are able to go to higher education. And within that confined context, it's difficult for individuals to be able to engage in economic activities that are likely to empower the families. For example, when we started the cash transfer initiative, it was very difficult for us to be able to reach the families that we had targeted because they were not bankable and they were not even allowed to do mobile banking. And so, you know, at the global level, we have these policies regarding security and regarding how governments deal with refugee communities. And at the very local level, when you are pushing out your interventions, sometimes those global policies can actually inhibit localized interventions. And so I do think that there needs to be a nexus between, you know, what we say at the global level and what is happening at the local level. Thank you.
No, that's a really important point, and it's part of what LERRN is trying to do, is to say, and in our partnership with IDRC, is to say, given the power of knowledge that's produced in local context and that understanding of context that comes from the knowledge ecosystems that are present, how can we better harness that knowledge and bring that diversity of perspectives into the global context to facilitate that nexus between, you know, the global and the local. But speaking of which, Jennifer, to put you on the spot on this question of momentum, on this question of the power of mobilizing these coalitions from a global context, and given the optimism that we have from Abdullahi, which I think is so important in these challenging times, to take inspiration from these examples of innovation and the leadership that we see. What impact have you seen in terms of the sustaining the momentum that comes out of the GRF and mobilizing this global coalition to respond to the specificity of context that we see? Jennifer, can I invite you to have the last word before I turn it back to Barbara to help us conclude? Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Just to comment about the Global Refugee Forum, I think, you know, we did see a huge upswell of interest and momentum, and I think that has been sustained. And really the Global Refugee Forum and the pledges worked at two levels. One was at the level of particularly of donors, but also of organizations and of member states making pledges. And I think this has been one of the really key issues, is when we talk about education, is inclusion in national systems. And there were a lot of pledges around this. And there's a really important complementarity between the work that is done by refugee organizations and refugee-led responses, but also ensuring that states and that international governments also continue to support and to take and share responsibility for supporting refugees. Sometimes, you know, that there needs to be that recognition of the importance of local knowledge, of local context, but also of responsibility sharing, so that we don't lose that. And just to mention, with the COVID response, I think we've seen a lot of organizations pivoting what they were doing to try and respond to the new needs. And just to mention that as part of the follow-up to the GRF, we'll be working with organizations to try and document how different entities have actually worked to support refugees. And we'll be reaching out and making a call for organizations to speak about their work. And I think also hearing from refugee-led organizations through partners, through networks like your own, to encourage people to speak about what they have done. Is important, that we have a multiplicity of voices and that we recognize that. But really, you know, issues such as inclusion, taking a range of the whole of society approach to responding to refugee issues is critically important to sustainability.
Yeah, no, that is critically important, and I really appreciate the emphasis that you've placed, Jennifer, on the importance of inclusion, which I think just lays such a critical foundation for what we do. Such rich contributions from all of you in your presentations and your engagement with the answers. My thanks to those who posted questions in the Q&A box. We are at 11 o'clock Ottawa time, which translates to much later in the day in other parts around the world. And so with that, it's my joy to be able to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone participating. And it's my pleasure to now turn it over to Barbara to say some words of conclusion and to close our proceedings. Barbara, back to you, please.
Thanks, everybody. I like James, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their excellent contributions to this very rich discussion, and thank everyone else also for their participation. I'm sure you will agree with me that this debate and the report findings and the specific insights we've heard from our panelists provide ample evidence for the urgent need to continue down this path of not only calling for better understanding, better actual operations of education programs for refugees, but also for the continuous importance of working on this subject and raising the voices of those who have a very good insight into what they need, what they want, and what is possible in local contexts as well as in the global arena. Thank you, everybody. And please note that this webinar is the second in a series to be co-hosted by IDRC and LERRN over the next few months. You will be able soon to find more details on our websites about the next webinar that is set to take place in mid-December, and will focus on a topic of refugee participation. A topic that, of course, we've already touched on today to some extent. The sense that refugees have a very strong sense of what they want, what they need, and very important insights to bring to their needs and how the global and local contexts and organization can help them do what they need to do to ensure their bright futures. So on that note, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.